Welcome, everyone. Really looking forward to hearing the survey, BASW survey today. We have pre-recorded it. So I'm Julia Ross, the chair of BASW currently. With me today are Ruth, our chief exec, and Annie Ho, who's hopefully, yes, there you are, Annie. We are all going to be listening to the pre-recorded set and we'll be available at the end to answer questions. Any questions, put them online. That would be great in the chat thing, sorry, and we'll be happy to answer them. So the seminar runs for about 40 minutes and we'll have 10 or 15 minutes at the end. And please tell us who you are so that we can have a good conversation. Looking forward to it. Thanks very much. Bye for now.
Hello, welcome to this webinar about BASW's survey, social work in 2023, a picture of social work in the UK. I'm Ruth Allen, I'm the Chief Executive of BASW and delighted to welcome you today, the day before World Social Work Day. On this webinar, I am joined by, I'm going to introduce each of them in turn. I hand over to them to introduce themselves. Julia Ross, our chair, hi.
Thank you, Ruth. My name is Julia Ross and I'm the chair of BASW. I'm really delighted to be here. So passing on over to Annie, I think.
Hello, everyone. I'm Annie. I am a registered social worker and I am a member of BASW and also the chair of the governance board of the Social Work Professional Support Service.
Thank you. I'm going to ask also, Rosanne, would you introduce yourself?
Ruth, hello everyone. My name is Rosanne Palmer. I am the Policy and Research Lead at BASW UK, and along with my colleague Victoria, I'm responsible for overseeing the running of the annual survey.
So we're delighted that we have achieved a second year running a survey of state of social work, the views of social workers, of our members and social workers beyond that. And Rosanne is going to present some of the main findings of that survey. You will find in chat the link to the 2023 survey, or I think it's actually called the 2022 survey, published in 2023. And this is also now on the website. That's the summary findings. There are more details to be released about our very rich survey over the coming months, but the summary findings, which you will hear in summary form in the presentation in a moment, give a really good overview of the headlines of what we found this year in our survey. So I'm now going to hand over to Rosanne, who will present those headline findings for the first part of this presentation. And then myself, Julia and Annie will be discussing what those findings mean to us, to BASW, to the sector, and hopefully that will be to bring to life in a way some of the very important statistical information that Rosanne is now going to share. So Rosanne, I'm going to hand over to you. I think you're going to share the screen.
I am. Just bear with me one moment. I'm sure we're all used to this by now. Here we go. There we go. Can you all see that?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Fabulous. Okay, so as Ruth just alluded to, we actually call this the annual survey for 2022. The main reason for that being that we largely have the survey open in December of 2022, as it allows people an opportunity to reflect on the year gone by. As Ruth said, I'm just going to briefly outline some of the top line findings from the report before handing over to Julia, Annie and Ruth for a discussion. So as I said, the survey was conducted in December 2022. We had just over 1,600 respondents from all four parts of the UK. In addition to the kind of more topical issues that we ask about, we also build up a professional profile of respondents, and I will return to that in a moment. But this is just to present you a brief overview of some key findings. So You will find all of these tables and charts and pie charts in the report. Here we just have a glimpse of the professional profile of respondents. So you can see that just over half reported themselves to be experienced social workers, and just over a quarter reported being in managerial or more senior roles. 2/3 of those who responded, or just under 2/3 of those who responded, were employees. Another 14% were self-employed or independent social workers, and just under 10% reported themselves to be agency social workers. The table at the bottom just shows the areas that that respondents reported as working in. You'll see at the top was children and families, just over half, followed by adults at just over a third. You will notice that those percentages don't add up. It's because people were allowed to choose more than one option to reflect the variety of work that so many of our practitioners do. In this year's survey, we covered a range of issues. Some of those were repeated topics from last year. Some of them expanded on topics from last year, and some of them were new issues. So for those questions that were familiar from the 2021 survey, this is because in addition to creating a snapshot of the profession, we're also trying to build up longitudinal data over time so that we can see if there are any emergent trends in views on recurrent issues, if you like, that face the profession. So we looked at things, for example, repeated questions on positive impact in the current most recent workplace, challenges in the workplace facing the profession, workload and additional hours. Progression and career development was new this year. Experiences with bullying, harassment and discrimination, we expanded on that because we wanted to find out more based on what was reported to us in last year's survey. Abuse in social work settings, also new. Impact of the cost of living crisis, this was introduced in response to developments in economic circumstances in the last sort of 12 months or so. And finally, we had a section on political engagement, which we introduced because one of the things we found in the 2021 survey was that respondents were really keen to see BASW engaging with decision makers and politicians. And we wanted to also ask about members' own political engagement so we can best understand how the organisation and its membership can work together and complement each other in order to do that. We're not obviously going to cover all of these topics today, but you will find them all covered in the summary report. So for our first key finding for today, respondents were asked to choose 3 statements, identifying what they felt had the most positive impact in their current or most recent workplace. This is a repeated question from last year, and what we found was that the same 3 options were the most frequently chosen. So peer support, effective multi-agency and or partnership working, an appropriate level of management and supervision. What we noticed in terms of a trend, insofar as you can determine a trend over a 2-year period, is that far more people chose peer support as one of their 3 options this year, but fewer people were choosing either effective multi-agency working or appropriate level of management and supervision. And it was actually quite a marked increase in terms of the proportion of people who chose peer support. We also asked respondents to choose what they felt to be the top 3 challenges in their current or most recent workplace, with a list of 14 options. Again, we found that the same 3 were chosen as last year, but they had changed order. So workload demands was now more frequently chosen last year and was now the most chosen option, then followed by demands of administrative tasks and adequacy of staffing levels. For our third key finding that we're choosing to highlight today, we also asked which 3 statements were, or which 3 options were considered to be the biggest challenges for the profession now and in the immediate future. And here we did see a change from last year in terms of the top 3 most chosen responses. The most chosen response was the continued failure to adequately fund social care. That came in more than 2/3 of respondents to the question chose that. And while that was still the most chosen option, we found that more people were choosing that option this year. The big change is that recruitment and retention had come up markedly from last year when it didn't make the top 3. And there'll be some further discussion about that after I finish this brief presentation. And then cuts to local services was also one of the most chosen options again, but chosen by a slightly smaller proportion of respondents than last year. The fourth issue, the fourth set of questions that I'm drawing out of this year's annual report is around whether respondents reported being happy working in the profession and reported being happy working in their current role. And in both cases, it was roughly 3/5 of respondents who replied to this question agreed or strongly agreed that they were happy working in the profession and happy working in their current role. Where this changed from last year was with the removal of the option to neither agree nor disagree. And what we found on removing that option was that people were more likely to say that they disagreed with the statement than to agree with the statement. So that 3/5 proportion is roughly the same proportion as last year, but more people are saying they disagreed with the statement after we removed one of the options in response to the question. We also, in the 2021 annual survey, we also asked some initial questions about whether respondents had experienced bullying, harassment and/or discrimination in their place of work or study during the past 12 months, or if they were aware of someone who had. And with the findings that we had from last year, what we decided to do this year was to introduce some more questions to try and unpack the 2021 findings in slightly more detail. So when we asked this question, just under 38% reported that they had either experienced this or had been aware or were aware of someone who had. That's a very similar proportion to last year. Those who reported that they had experienced or were aware of someone who had this experience were then asked some follow-up questions. I've highlighted the one about what people thought was the reason behind the bullying, harassment and/or discrimination here, but we did also have questions, a question around the relationship between the people involved, and also a free text option where people could expand and tell us anything additional that they wanted to. And on the basis of the work that we've done here, we will be producing a follow-up briefing. So that's some of the further work that Ruth alluded to. But what you can see here of those who when asked what they thought, of those who reported that experience, when they asked what they thought was the reason, the top responses chosen were professional grievance at just over 1/3, and on the basis of ethnicity at also around the 1/3 mark. A new section that we introduced for this year was around the cost of living crisis and the impact in particular of that crisis on the people that respondents were working with. Almost half agreed or strongly agreed that the number of people they worked with had increased since the crisis began. 3/4 agreed or strongly agreed that people they worked with had been driven into deeper poverty. Almost 4/5 agreed or strongly agreed that the crisis was causing additional problems for the people they worked with. And the really interesting thing about those two findings is that more people more respondents were strongly agreeing with the statement rather than just agreeing with the statement. And that's actually unusual with this type of question. So we can see something there that may reflect how intensely the impact of the crisis is being felt. And finally, almost a third of respondents agreed or strongly agreed that they were supporting more people with using their own resources as the cost of living has increased. And just coming on to my final slide, what I'm doing here is just sharing a few quotes with you that were submitted in the different comment boxes that were available throughout the survey. What we see here, and I think it may well be reflected in the discussion that follows without trying to preempt it, is that it's an overarching theme that was coming through in the survey, is that the social workers, the respondents to this survey, are truly passionate about what they do, but are struggling with the circumstances in which they are trying to do it. So you see people talking about the amazing people in social work, people not hearing about the positive impact social work has had, people who love their profession, who love social work, but recognise how difficult it is becoming in the current circumstances. There is obviously much more in the full report. We'll put the link to the report on the website. That's available in the chat. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and hand back to Ruth, Julia and Annie to discuss some of what I've just shared with you.
Thanks very much, Rosanne. It's a very strong picture. Thank you for showing those headlines, and there is much more in the summary report and more to come in the full report and other releases. I'd like to go straight over now to Julia and then to Annie, just to get your initial reactions to the presentation and to those headline findings. If I come to you first, Julia.
Thanks very much, Ruth, and thanks, Rosanne. That's absolutely fascinating. I was delighted when I first saw it because it gives a real picture of what social work is about. It tells us that social workers are driven by values, that they have a lot of integrity, they care about the right things, they care about the people that they work with, and lastly too, that they are resilient. I mean, I'm certain that social work is more difficult now than it has been in the past, but let's not pretend it's not always been difficult. It's not an easy job. And I think the things that we've heard about what social workers have been saying has been really strong and very passionate about what they do. So I was fascinated by it.
Thanks, Julia. Coming over to you, Annie, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, I think for me, the headline findings are concerning, but sadly not surprising to me. And I think when you look at the final quotes and the key topics, you can see very clearly each of the headings intersect and interrelate to each other. You see the importance of peer support going up, the importance of appropriate level of management and supervision going down. I'm sure we'll talk a bit more about it. But I wonder perhaps the current climate is such that senior management has to spend so much more time inevitably on managing increasingly tight budgets, for example. There's a headline on that, inadequate staffing levels, recruitment and retention, and less time and energy for sustaining meaningful staff well-being. So a lot of really hot topics coming into one, really.
Thanks, Annie. If I could just stay with you for a moment, and maybe you could say a bit about what seems to come over is this kind of dissonance between appreciating being a social worker, the value of peer support, which has gone up. So we're appreciating our colleagues, the values of being a social worker, and kind of sort of poor conditions of working life. This isn't a new thing. You know, recent surveys that we've done with Germain Revalier and Bath Spa, that other agencies and other parts of the sector have done in by country, but also UK, have found similar things, and I wondered what you think what you think about that, about the impact on social workers, and maybe how it comes through in your work with the professional support service, which you're very involved with.
Yeah, happy to talk about that. I have to admit, it does come through very, very strongly through the coaching work I've been involved in with the professional support service. And I started as a volunteer coach right at the beginning of COVID and continue to date. And we hear coaches sharing very similar struggles, demonstrated by the quotes that Rosanne made at the end of the presentation. They love their work. What Julia said, they have strong belief in the fundamental values of the profession. But actually, that makes the dissonance and the struggle and the challenge even harder, because a lot of them don't believe the wider organization, the structures actually substantiate those really fundamental values. We hear in coaching a lot about social workers wanting to continue because of what they believe in and why they entered the profession in the first place. And yet they increasingly feel they're almost sacrificing their own well-being. And it came to a point when the cost is simply too high.
Yeah. Thanks. Thanks very much for that. And I should say that in the full report, there will be more made of the qualitative data that we've got, which came through free text, and which members of BASW who are researchers are helping us to look at. So we will get the richness of some of that qualitative, the reasons behind some of the statistics should come through. Julia, if I could come to you again. This large majority of respondents report worsening poverty in the communities with the individuals and families they're working with, and use of their own resources to quite a high degree in sort of ameliorating some of that. I mean, what do you think the implications are of increasing poverty for practitioners and also for BASW's focus in the coming year, in the coming time?
Thank you, and thank you, Annie. I'm fascinated in your comments, because you've been there at the front line coaching people who are working directly in services. There is no doubt at all, I have no doubt, that poverty is not only with us, but is going to continue, and that it's having a very dramatic effect on people who use services and practitioners. I think those figures, those percentages that Rosanne pointed out in Key Findings 6 are very, very dramatic, and I think we need to talk and understand about them a great deal more. Almost 50% agreed or strongly agreed that the number of people they work with has increased. That has to say something. It has to say something to politicians and the public and government departments as well. 75% agreeing or strongly agreeing that people they worked with have been driven into deeper poverty. That's outrageous. That is at a time where there's a cost of living crisis, more poverty. And we all know that poverty doesn't just have an immediate impact, but it has a generational impact over time. So finally, the 80%, nearly 80% agreed or strongly agreed that the crisis was causing additional problems for people that they worked with. And why wouldn't it? Of course it will. So I'm just going to briefly deal with the last point of the 32%, and then I want to come back to the poverty issue. But 32% are supporting people with their own resources. Now, that says so much about social workers, but it also says a lot about the resources that they have and that they don't have. We don't know, or we may be able to dig a little deeper into that to find out what's happening, but I'm perfectly certain they're like teachers who will give, school lunches to pupils if they don't have any, etc. So I know that social workers won't see people in poverty and be able to work away from it, and yet a lot will actually have to do that, and that must be so difficult. So poverty is important. Poverty is with us for a while. It's not going to go away. And poverty, I think, for the first time at every level of society, obviously not the very wealthy, but a lot of people in middle incomes, and indeed social workers themselves, are experiencing difficulty, and we know that. But let's not focus on that. Let's really think about what we can do. So BASW has a poverty campaign that I've been paying a lot of interest in, and we have a number of podcasts about it. We have a number of resources. I don't see any other profession worrying about poverty in the way that we do and that we should do. So we have 3 asks in our poverty campaign. One is to do with delaying the debt recovery stage. We did actually try or have as one of our major asks the need to update in line with inflation, benefits in line with inflation, and luckily that happened. Second one, though, is about ensuring that evictions don't happen, so delaying that as much as we can. And the third one is the cap on the 2-child benefit, so that bigger families aren't disadvantaged, whereas at the moment they obviously are. So those are the things that we want BASW to do, and that BASW can do, and that our members, social workers, want us to do. I'm not sure at the moment how much the general public and the politicians and local authorities really understand the contribution that social work can make to that, and how it affects the context within which social workers work professionally. So hopefully we can do something about that. Hopefully we can make a difference. I'm sure that social workers out there who are working day to day will be looking to BASW to be able to have some very definite things to say, and we might well be able to add to that as we continue this conversation. I wondered, Ruth, one of the things that was mentioned before by Annie was the implications of recruitment and retention. I'd like to hear more from you about that.
Yes, it was interesting that for the first time, concerns about recruitment and retention have really sort of jumped up in people's awareness as I think it was second to top main challenge and concern. And this year, over the last particularly last 6 months, last 12 months, the greatly apparent problems of recruitment of experienced staff in particular, and keeping experienced staff and enabling newly qualified staff to kind of move through and feel that they're coming into and are going to stay in jobs that they want to do. I think particularly in statutory services, statutory adults and statutory children's services, which of course isn't all of social work, but is the big chunk of where most people work within local authorities or in statutory services. So we're paying a lot of attention to this, and we're part of the leadership group in England. But of course, this is an UK-wide phenomenon. Massive issues in, for instance, Northern Ireland in terms of recruitment and retention, but actually across the UK. So we're addressing this at nation level across the UK. We're part of the leadership efforts collectively with colleagues who are employers, regulators, other professional development types of organisations, to how we can address this. I think a key to this is there is definitely a need for culture change, as well as financial and funding changes, as well as sort of structural professional development career pathway changes that are needed, I think, across all employers. And the culture, we could talk about all of those. I'm going to just mention culture changes in particular, because I think there's something fundamental about employers understanding what it means to be a professional social worker with a set of regulatory standards, professional ethics, expectations on oneself to be able to do a good job, and then to be trying to do it in an environment where those things are not fully valued and are not enabled. And that becomes an intolerable situation for some people. I think many people work with that and work around it and develop ways to work around it. And the peer support in that context is so important. Being able to know that you share those views and values with your peers. So we want to very much support that peer support. But I think as a professional association, we need to enable social workers to feel connected to the bigger sense of being a professional, that they have a right to a decent working condition, that we can work with them and with their employers about creating some of those better working conditions, and we can provide services such as the professional support service and of course our advice and representation service that works with people when they have particular employment or regulatory issues. So I think there's a need for a real strategic look at how we recruit people into the profession and then ensure we sustain them. There are of course developments in England, for instance, around a new pathway for children's social work, early career framework. It'll take a long time really for some of these things to unfold, and we do need recognition now about how we can create better working conditions for professionals, social workers as professionals. So I'll start, but one could go on about these for such a long time. I won't. I'm going to just go back to Rosanne and just ask you quickly, thank you very much for that presentation. Is there anything else you'd like to note before we go on to the final part of our discussion here?
I mean, I think there are two things that probably strike me, Ruth, based upon the discussion that you've just been having. The first is to point to the fact that there are work questions on opportunities for career progression, career development and training opportunities in this year's survey. So you will find, people who do want to look to that will find that in the summary report. So we do have some more data, some additional information to look at around that. And I think the other thing that strikes me, and I think you've all pointed to it in different ways, is how interconnected all of these issues are. The way in which they interrelate with one another. We can't disentangle them and put one over there and one over there. They're all going to have to come together in order for circumstances to in order for those conditions you've been talking about to improve.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So so we're now kind of in the last part of our discussion here, and I'd like to come back to you first, Annie, if that's okay. Could you say a bit about how do we empower and develop practitioners, leaders, supervisors? You might want to say a bit more about the coaching and mentoring, because I guess one of the key roles of BASW is to be that independent, there for you support to social workers, but perhaps more broadly, how do we develop some of those that hopeful, leaderly kind of confidence and keep people connected with that going forward?
It's a big question. We've all been asking ourselves throughout our career. I think the first thing I'd like to say to any individual social worker, manager, leader out there who's struggling with all these headline issues we talked about and juggling them day in and day out, is you're not alone. And that's the message we try to really highlight in the professional support service. I joined the coaching because I believe in it, and increasingly I feel I become part of the social work community, the social workers family. And I think I really want to encourage people, yes, it's hard, I don't deny it, but together we can be stronger. And through the coaching service, we can hear, support, listen to your individual voice. And that's really important. It is so lacking in everyday pressurized social work to have the time and the space to enter into a conversation with an individual coach and reflect. We all know is a real luxury in everyday pressures of social work. So I really want to encourage people out there that one of the answers out of many answers is to allow yourself to have that space and time for reflection. People tend to think we come to coaching because of all the difficulties and challenges we have. And of course, those are really, really important. We hear you, we share your burden, we observe with you, we support you, we suggest ways of moving forward. But I think coaching can also be a celebration of how, what Julia said, how resilient you are, how good you are at your work. And sometimes, again, managers don't have the time or space or social workers to talk about it. And I really want people to recognize that stronger voice that comes from being together. And the individual voice, of course, will inform the collective voice and BASW voice, which I always think, you know, social workers need BASW to speak for them. I don't want to undermine the importance of all those issues. And one of the things that really do come out very strongly through the professional support service, it's difficult to choose one item, but the experience of discrimination or feeling injustice, that comes across very strongly through the professional support service. And I think partly because social workers are very good at supporting other people and perhaps less good at looking after ourselves. Social workers, they say to me, well, I'm not going to challenge that because I believe in being non-judgmental. So I just want to say, call out to social workers out there that you're not alone. It's important to hold those values to ourselves, but also how people treat us, how the public perceive us, how our managers and supervisors manage us. So yeah, that would be my very, very key message to social workers, whatever level, whatever stage of your progression, but also to work together towards a more hopeful future.
Thanks very much, Annie. Thank you. Julia, could I come to you? Maybe you could reflect on, you know, how do we have influence on this in, you know, with politicians or the media, with employers, and what, you know, what can BASW do? What is BASW doing? What more could BASW do in terms of standing up for the collective voice of social work in kind of those more influencing sort of forums?
First of all, thank you, Ruth. First of all, I'd like to say to Annie that people like you give us hope, and perhaps every team should have an Annie or access to an Annie. Maybe not an Annie, but a coach. So that really made me feel as though I'm not alone. And being in BASW and having worked as a social worker most of my life, I'm still using my social work skills, and those are so important. So thank you for that. Ruth, you talked about the influencing politicians and the public and others. I really think we have to give ourselves and it's our responsibility to take a strong line with that and have a stronger voice. And I know that we are doing some things, and I'm hoping we can do more, because it's creating what we need to do is to create a better understanding of what social work does and what it doesn't do. I often listen to Radio 4, and this morning there was a lot of talk about the family courts and very little mention of what social work does. It's as though the courts operated just independently, and yet the huge value that social work contributes to the lives of children and to adults at every stages of their lives is really not understood. So we need respect, but from respect will come from understanding. And I think one of BASW's main aims should be to really work with, it must be with politicians, because social work works within a political environment. So with politicians, with the public, and also, I suppose, with the media. So I know that we are coming up, and I don't know if there's time for you to say anything more, with really looking at how the media portrays social work. I think it's got a lot better. I don't think it's always good, but I think it's got a lot better. And I'm watching out for it and commenting on it whenever it happens. So that, I think, will make a difference. I think BASW, as I said earlier, must stand up on tackling poverty. Nobody else is going to do it. None of the other professions really have the emphasis that we have. And the other thing that I think I'd really like us to see us doing is developing new leaders. We talked about leadership, you talked about leadership, and I don't think there's a vacuum there at the moment, but as Annie said, there's a lot of time taken up with managing in difficult resources. So I'm hoping that BASW can take more of a lead in social care and in developing social work leaders for the future. And I'm really confident that we can do that. We have a really good, strong professional organisation, which, unlike many others, is growing in numbers and is growing in what it does well. And I'm really proud of that, having been a BASW member for 50 odd years now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We've come to the end of this webinar. I think that's been fascinating. I hope it's helped to bring our survey to life. And I think we've really ended with that, a hopeful sense of why it's so important for BASW to work together as to be representing social work, and for us to be a collectivity of social workers, as Annie has reflected, as Julia, thank you for that, you've reflected as well. We are doing work around media representation. I'll just get a little plug in, which is we have the first Social Work Journalism Awards that BASW is organising, now running and still open for nominations. And I think that is important, that the representation of social work in the media develops and changes. It's in the survey that people have very, very little confidence in how the media generally portrays social work. And there are definitely things we can do about that. So we will keep working within BASW to address all of the issues that are raised in this survey. Thank you, Rosanne, and to Victoria, our colleague, who have been working so hard to bring this together. Thank you to all of those who have listened and watched this webinar. Please read the report and look out for the further reports and findings and analysis that will be coming out. And have a great World Social Work Day. Bye-bye. So, don't go away, because we've managed to gather again today to have a bit of live panel discussion, which we weren't sure we were going to be able to do, but we have been able to do. And thank you for the questions and comments that come into the chat, which I would like to now pick up and go through some of those. There's been some answers offered, but I think there's some really, really interesting points. And I hope that presentation was useful, that you will also link to the report and read that and get a bit more under the bonnet of all the things that the survey has been able to find. But I'm going to go through these as they kind of came in on the chat. We had a question about policy. How do these findings, and indeed I guess the findings from other surveys which find very similar things, how do they impact, or how should they impact on policy? And I had some exchange there with Simon in the audience, and this was about governmental policy, but it's also about other policies, the policies of organisations, as well as government policies around social work and investment and so on. But would either of you, Julia or Annie, like to come in on influencing? Maybe it links in with the question that came in about political influencing as well. Julia, would you like to pick up on that?
I'd love to. Thanks, Ruth. And it's a really good question. And getting into the politics and the understanding of that was a good question about accountability too, and where accountability needs to be held by the decision makers, not just the individual social workers. And I think that's really, really important. Poverty is a political issue. And the cost of living crisis is a political issue. So we must, in BASW and as social workers and leaders in social work, because that's what we are. And leadership happens at all levels. It's not just, whoever it is at the top. It can happen at every level. So back to what's important. Tackling that and tackling the politics and the policy is something that BASW, I think, can probably do better and do more of. I think BASW is a very strong and enduring organisation. We've shown that, and our membership continues to grow. But there are things that we could do differently. We could engage more strategically on policy level discussions. We can use our membership to enrich that, and I think that's something I would like to see. I think on the other P for me is the other professions. We must work with the other professions because they are our allies as well. So I was talking the other day to Robin Miller at Birmingham University, Professor Miller, about that multidisciplinary element that social work is so good at. So if we can affect and have an impact on policy that affects the whole person and whole communities, then I think that would be very exciting.
Thanks, Julia. Yeah, I think there's always more to do in terms of strategic influencing. I was interested also in the question that came in that linked, it's also strategic, but at a local level, there's national policy, there's national investment decisions that get taken that do, or in this case, don't show up in national budgets in terms of investment in social work and social care, but also at a more local level. I wondered, Annie, I mean, I know that you're not working in that environment now, but the local politicians understanding when they're making their funding decisions or their culture setting decisions, how about, do they understand what social work is? I don't know whether you wanted to perhaps reflect a bit on that and how it impacts social work.
Yes, thank you, Ruth, and thank you for the question relating to local politics and local. There was another question about private and voluntary sector. We all talk about place-based, policies, arrangements, and so on. And we know that social work needs to be rooted in the local community, in the local people. So I think that is really important. I think that if Ruth and Julia don't mind, I haven't had time to check with them. I was reflecting on the very useful exercise we did on our council away day when we talk about people like us, people like BASW. As Julia said, we need to ally with them more, and people who may be different from us, which we would need to campaign and educate and raise awareness. So I don't think we do enough as social workers and social work managers, going back to my own specific area of influence, because again, the work pressure is such that our narrow focus is very much on the day in and day out pressures of the work. But without a doubt, we know that we have to do social work differently. We know we have to engage with the voluntary and private sector. We know we have to engage with people who use services. So I like to think that together, again, we can do more of that. I may be digressing from the question, but I'll just say that I would really, really invite everyone in the webinar to look at the report and to think about the implications for your team, for your local community, place it in the context of your local social work where it is happening. Have that team discussion, have that organization, local culture discussion.
Thanks, and thanks, Annie. And that reminds me of a question that we've had, or a comment about community social work and about whole. Once I think the point was being made there was about kind of thinking back to the idea of community social work and one profession of social work, generic social work, in localities, which of course is, in a sense, is quite historic now, in that we have very subspecialism or specialist divided approaches to social work development and leadership. Mental health here, children's there, adults there. But I think one of the things that's and that's probably a whole that's a whole other set of discussions to be had. What's interesting, I think, about the survey, and this will be drilled into more as we unpack more of the findings. We're finding very similar experiences, certainly in the different parts of statutory services. So the issues seem to be quite endemic in, you know, adults and children's services at the moment. I don't think there's significantly great differences there. But it would be very interesting to, I think, understand more and probably give more value and visibility to social workers who are working in these very diverse contexts, who are still working as social workers, bringing their ethics, their values, their practices, being registered, you know, working to standards in the voluntary sector, in private sector, in independent practice, and so on. But the point about kind of community work is, I'm going to just put it out there, is community work still, should it still be alive? Has it got relevance to some of the findings, Julia?
Yes, of course it has. I mean, I go back to Bob Holman, and I don't know how many of you remember him, but a working class, he lived on a working class estate and practiced community social work back in the 70s when I began social work. And of course it's still alive. The new development in with communities of interest are some nice examples of that. So it's using and working with communities in a very different way. And I think we do that. Well, I don't know, it's a question for our audience, perhaps. Do we do that as part of our social work practice, or has things like that got squeezed out by the day-to-day task of doing social work? I'm also interested in the question around, I'm going to nab that one, of smarter spaces, because of course smarter spaces make, it was Paul's question, I think, really make a difference. They make a difference in agile working, and they make a difference too in how people work together. We know that co-production is much easier where there is co-location. So we ought to give more time and attention, I think, to that. And I think one of the things on the horizon with the NHS is, for example, virtual wards. Now, virtual wards are a lovely example of working together in a smarter space. So we need to think a bit more radically, I think, about how we do social work and how it develops in future.
There was quite a, I think it was about, right, I think about 290 out of the 1,600 were from working in the NHS. It's that sort of number, wasn't it, Rosanne? So it was a decent sample of people working in the NHS. And I think one of the things we'll need to do with understanding working conditions, working experiences, is what is it like to be employed in, particularly the NHS, because there is a growing number of social workers in the NHS employed in integrated services of not just in mental health, but in others. How do we do that better? How do we support social workers in those kinds of environments? You know, there may be social workers in primary care kinds of settings. There are social workers in schools now. How do we really support social workers to have that kind of golden thread of being a social worker, having the identity, the support and the development opportunities, and also having the great benefits of working in fantastic teams. You know, teams can be fantastic when they work well. When they don't work well, they're one of the worst places to work, but we know that. But how do we really support social work in those kinds of integrated and multi-professional settings? I think is something for BASW really to think about. Just kind of picking up on another theme that I think in a way came also out of the presentation, and that was something for BASW, I think BASW can really help with. One of the most positive things, and this I think is pretty much how you said it, Rosanne, that came out was about peer support. We have to tackle the evident deficits of resourcing, of good supervision, of, you know, great kind of terms and conditions, and the other things that are being exposed to bullying and harassment. All of those came through in the survey. We also have to build, I think, on the good things. And one of the good things that came over was around peer support. And I just wondered whether, Julia or Annie, you'd like to comment more on what that might mean, because BASW can very much support peer support, I think. really augment that sense of being part of a community. And I just wondered if there's anything you'd like to say about that in the last few minutes.
I think over to you, Annie, because you're the expert on this. Is that right?
I was going to say, maybe perhaps not answering the question in a very positive way to start with, and then go to the positives. I think I would like to acknowledge the increase in peer support and the increase in the importance for social workers. But I also acknowledge and want to emphasize that peer support should not replace or should not be in place of good management, supervision, and organization support. That is really important. I think there is a lot of strength in social workers coming together because we understand each other, the realities of social work. And I think we need to continue that. But through that, it's more than support, it's more actually putting our voices together, what we want, what we share and what we want to look forward to, which is why I encourage you so much to look at the survey report. Yeah, I'll go to Julia because I'm very aware of the time sharing the questions around.
Thanks very much. I think you said it all, Annie. Peer support, that's what BASW does and does really, really well and always has done and always will do. So I think that we can build on this survey. There are some important questions for us there. And I think together with our membership, we can create the answers that we need to move everything forward. So thank you.
Thank you very much. There's some, just very quickly, there are other really useful comments that have come in. We will collect all these up because this feels like another step forward in our conversation with our members, with our sector, and some of the solutions to some of the issues the many issues that we've shown in this survey lie. Absolutely, the point made I think by Jerry online. Social workers aren't responsible for poor structures and for lack of investment, but we have to find ways, of influencing, bringing our voice together, as you were saying, Annie, having strong macro level advocacy, not just for social work and social workers, but of course for the people we're working with. That's the primary point of it. Some points, further points here about the importance of local politicians understanding the duties, responsibilities, professionalism of social workers that they may be responsible for instance, within local authorities. And Joan, thank you for your comments on that. And yeah, just a whole range of really useful comments. I think we've covered most of them in one way or another. So, as I said, this is the beginning. It's always, it's another beginning of an ongoing conversation. I think the survey that we're doing year on year is allowing us now, with the help of Rosanne and our other colleague Victoria in particular, who put this together, are analysing it, will publish focused reports as well. Rosanne, do you want to just say something briefly about the focused reports that are coming out, which I think will show where our emphasis will be?
Yeah, I mean, possibly report isn't quite the right word, but what we're working on is around 3 thematic briefings based on some of the key issues that came out. So one is around anti-poverty work and the cost of living crisis. One is around the recruitment and retention issues, and I think the third will be around some of the issues that arose in relation to the questions on bullying, harassment and discrimination. And what we're feeding into these, some of these sections had open-ended questions, and obviously qualitative analysis takes a little bit longer. So we've been using the Social Work Practitioner Research Network to help us drill down into that.
Brilliant. So there's more to come. So we'll get more out of this. As I said, this is a year-on-year comparative survey that we can do. And we hope that you find this year's survey interesting, illuminating, useful wherever you are and wherever you are in social work. And there is more to come this year, as Rosanne said there. So just to finish, to thank
Julia, to thank Annie, to thank Rosanne. My thanks, Ruth Ann, and my thanks for everybody who's attended, and have a great World Social Work Day. Bye-bye.